It happens that I'm outside recording this, so if you hear airplanes and my chickens running around and dogs barking and people talking and music playing, that's why. We reach Iran. Iran gets a lot of bad press, a lot of bad media, and probably a lot of that it deserves. At the same time, we have this strange relationship with Saudi Arabia that's fairly strong, and we have no relationship whatsoever with Iran. Of course, both Iran and Saudi Arabia are dictatorships. Iran is a theocratic dictatorship. Saudi Arabia is a monarchical dictatorship backed by theocrats. And in both cases, any dissent is crushed viciously. Iran was the first country in the Persian Gulf to begin to produce oil. This began in 1903. Now, it was the British who were in that area of the Persian Gulf looking for the oil. The reason was because they had begun to shift their navy over from a coal-based navy to an oil-based navy, and they needed that natural resource in order to be able to power their naval ships. The United States was also there looking around for oil, but it was primarily the British who were the movers and shakers at that point. Iran today has about 10% of the world's known reserves of oil, and they're the second largest producer of oil in the Persian Gulf. Obviously, the Saudis are number one. I say that they're the second largest producer, but of course, the Iranians have all sorts of sanctions against them and sometimes find it difficult to trade their stock, which is oil. At the same time, there's no way to dust for oil. So to know whether this is Iranian or Iraqi or Kuwaiti or Saudi oil, there's no way to know this sort of thing. Let's take a look at the population. There are 82 million people in Iran. These people are mostly Farsi-speaking Persians. Persian is their ethnicity. They are not Arabs. That doesn't mean that there's no Arabs or other diversity within the country, but the overwhelming majority of people who live in Iran are Persians. The language most of the people speak there, Farsi, is an Indo-European language, which means it's related to English and Hindi, for that matter, and Spanish and French. It's not related to Arabic. They use the Arabic script to write with, but the language they speak is not related to Arabic any more than English is related to Arabic. In addition to that, they account for about 75% of the world's Shiite Muslims. There are two basic fundamental branches of Islam. The first is the Sunni branch. People who practice the Sunni branch are called Sunnis. This accounts for about 80% of the total of the population of Muslims on earth. The other major branch is the Shia branch. The people who practice that branch are called Shiites. They account for about 17% of the total of Muslims in the world. The split happened shortly after the founder of the religion, Muhammad, died, and there's a question as to who was going to be the rightful successor. As a result of that, the religion broke into these two branches relatively quickly after the religion was founded. With Christianity, you probably know that there are three main branches of Christianity. There's Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Protestantism. And then there are some other smaller branches as well. So it's not uncommon, and there's a chicken right there. It's not uncommon for religions to break into branches based on theology and their views on the religion. Kind of like Cuba, we're going to split it into two historical eras. The first one is pre-1979. So before 1979, Iran was being run by what was known as the Pahlavi dynasty. This ran from 1925 to 1979. It sounds long and old because of the word dynasty, but that's not what it was. After World War I, the British were nominally in control of that area, and what they did was this. They set up a kind of caretaker government, and they told the person who they set up in charge not to start a dictatorship. But of course, what he did was he started a dictatorship. His name was Shah Pahlavi, or the Shah of Iran, which means the King of Iran. Ultimately, his family continued to rule the country. so that the last leader of Iran, who was a member of the Pahlavi family, was also called Shah Pahlavi, or the Shah of Iran. The Shah tended to be very pro-Western and pro-American. I remember myself when I was in junior high school, middle school, that I had an Iranian student from Long Beach State who was tutoring me math. The interesting thing was he taught me a lot about Iran and global politics. He was only 19 or 20, and very little about math. But I had very interesting conversations with him because at that time, the United States exchanged a lot of students. Primarily, the students came from Iran to the United States, of course. And then they studied mostly like he was studying, engineering and things like that. And then they went back to Iran and they worked, or some of them stayed here. However, although pro-Western and pro-American, the Shah and his family and the military that they controlled were prone to violent repression, sometimes excessively violent repression. What that led to was it led to people in Iran slowly becoming tired of the Shah and his family. And then, in 1979, there was a revolution. And we refer to this typically in the United States as the Islamic Revolution. It's probably better referred to as the Iranian Revolution. And in that revolution, the Shah was overthrown. Ultimately, he fled to the United States. He had prostate cancer, and I believe he died about 2 years later. The man who took over was Ayatollah Khomeini. He ruled Iran until 1989. The word Ayatollah is an honorific title. It means Grand Holy One of God. His first name was Rullah. And he established a theocracy. A theocracy is a government run by religious leaders. In other words, they're telling the people, whether they believe this or not, that they have a direct telephone line to God that is telling them how to run the government. The obvious problem with this is that if you try to rise up against them, you're not rising up against them, you're rising up against God, him or herself. And of course, as a result of that, they smash you. When he died in 1989, the man who took over and the man who still runs the country is Ayatollah Khomeini. He's referred to commonly as the supreme leader. The current situation in Iran is fraught. It remains very anti-American and anti-Western. At least the government remains that way. Many of the people do not feel like that anymore, though. The country is isolated globally by a whole host of sanctions, and this has caused desperation economically. At the same time, Iran has nuclear power plants. There's some evidence that they were moving towards building nuclear weapons, but this seems to have at least slowed down, if not completely stopped, in recent years. At the same time, they do seem to have a loyal military. And as long as the military remains loyal to the theocracy can remain in power. They're heavily involved and heavily invested in the regional wars that have been going on in Iraq, in Syria, even in Yemen. And this has stretched the country thin. Now, Iran has, for that part of the world, an excellent and powerful military. At the same time, as the United States has seen, when you begin to spread your military all over the place and are involved in multiple wars, it becomes very, very difficult to maintain real military power. Their population has become restless, especially the younger population. About 70% of the population is under 35 years old. I'll tell you a story before I end this. Back about 20 years ago, in Iran, there was a professor at the University of Tehran. He wrote an article in the newspaper at that time. They were allowing greater openness. Iran kind of vacillates back and forth between some amount of openness and then very tight control. And when he wrote this article, he said that the Ayatollahs were not really speaking for God. They were speaking for themselves, and they wanted to maintain power. He was instantaneously arrested, and the students rioted. At that time, the United States actually had reporters in Iran. And I remember reading an article in the Los Angeles Times, and this one student had given his name to the Los Angeles Times, and there was this fantastic quote that he gave. It was this: when he was asked, "What is your goal?" he said, "We are looking for freedom of expression and freedom after expression." That's the rub, isn't it? You could go in the middle of Pyongyang in North Korea and scream whatever you want about the little boy king there. It's what happens afterwards that's the real question. I was working with a Vietnamese student at that time who was an immigrant to the United States. And she was typing out all of these quotes for me that I have in my classroom at D2 at 202 at SAC. And I was looking over her shoulder while she was typing this on my computer in my office. And I said, "What do you think about that one?" Knowing that she'd come from a dictatorship. And she looked up at me and she said, "He's dead." And then she just continued to type.